Welcome. So today we're going to take a little bit of a diversion from our normal course. This might actually produce a secondary video series, Let's Talk About, where we take a game concept and explore it a little bit deeper in context of the Lyra starter project. So if you want to see more of the Let's Talk About series, please like it or do a comment, and I'll put together a list of other topics to break out in the Let's Talk About series. But why we put this together is we needed to understand this area of the system a little bit better in order to fix some of the problems we were experiencing with our inventory system. So this is probably a branching point between the two series. So let's jump into it. So first we need to think a little bit about the death event and how the death event is handled in a variety of different game styles. So Lyra being primarily a match-based system, when you die, you basically lose all your stuff and you're respawned. So in a match-based system, the consequence of death is basically you have to run around, pick up all your guns again, get back into the match. You also contribute negatively to your team's score. And so match-based, the severity of dying in a match-based system is the having to go get your stuff again and then contributing to the scoring system. Many people have put videos together around a battle royale, which basically means your stuff is dropped on the ground and it's game over. You don't get to respawn. So it's very close to a match-based system in that the only difference is I don't get to respawn. I've got one life and I'm out. As you move further and further up to the right, so if you move from a match-based system to a survival-based system, you likely are going to drop your stuff in the world, and you're going to respawn at the last sort of save point. And now you're faced with going to retrieve your stuff, right? So you generally in a survival system, you're practically naked, and you run forward to grab your equipment, your gear, before that dropped inventory expires into the world. If you think about it from a MOBA perspective, you really keep all your stuff, right? So in a MOBA, your penalty is that your respawn timer gets longer and longer each time you die. But when you do respawn, everything you had with you is still with you. So this is the first scenario where we need to keep all of our inventory through spawning. And if you keep moving to the right, it's sort of an action RPG or an MMO or even a couch co-op. In all those scenarios, you generally keep your stuff. And so that was the problem we were facing, which is the default settings for Lyra meant that our inventory would be wiped away to zero every time we died. And as such, if we were going to construct a game anywhere to the right-hand side of this chart, then we needed to find a way to not lose all of our inventory when we died. So that took us down a journey of exploring the death mechanics inside of the Lyra platform. So as we started to trace our way through the death event, it kind of all starts with the ability system component receiving damage either from the environment or from another player, but essentially damage is being applied to the ability system component that's attached to the player state. This is very common. There's lots of examples of how gameplay ability system handles health, max health, and damage. What's interesting about Lyra is on the Lyra character, there is a health component. And that component is listening in to the ability system component for changes in our health status. So the Lyra character's health component is the hook point where the ability system communicates back and forth with the health component. The health component then monitors a couple of death states. When you're alive, you are not dead. Then when you begin death, you have a death started state, which applies a tag status death dying. When you're done dying, you're death finished, and we get the status death dead. So those are applied inside the health component. There's also an out of health event, which is triggered asynchronously via the gameplay event death, and that kicks off this chain. And then there's a broadcast message that comes out of the health component Lyra elimination message, which basically updates all of your UI elements. So you were eliminated kind of stuff turns the screen red. Many of the UI elements are listening to the Lyra eliminated message. In addition, so is the scoring mechanism. So every time the Lyra elimination message is sent, the scoring class picks that up and processes it based on game dynamics. So different games will treat the elimination differently. If we go back up, well, let's finish this path. So when the gameplay event death occurs, that automatically fires off a gameplay ability called Hero Death. That gameplay ability is responsible for triggering the gameplay cue, Character Death, which then fires the gameplay cue called Death, which is basically the disassembly effect that you see on the character when you die. You fall into little cubes. That's all handled inside this gameplay cue. So these are all kind of happening off the out of health event. Once the death start is triggered, there is a listener on the auto spawn. So if you have auto spawn set up, it has an activation policy of on spawn, which means as soon as the character spawns into the world, this gameplay ability is going to also initiate. And when it does initiate, it binds to the death listener. It binds its death listener to the health component. So it's sitting here listening in for this death start event. All the time you're playing, it's sitting there just listening and waiting. It's also listening to a gameplay event reset, so that if there's a reset set, such as a match starts and you were in mid-death, that will automatically reset and you won't complete the death event. You'll just immediately go to the beginning of the new match. It's also responsible for spawning the UI timer. So it spawns the respawn timer that ticks down in the middle of the screen. It makes, at the end of the timer, which is actually the visual to a delay node that's inside the auto respawner, counting down at the same duration. When that expires, it makes a request to the game mode to be put back into the game. So at this point, once the timer expires, it makes a request to go into the game mode. The game mode does its request player restart, which calls the player controller, which does a server restart player, which calls the game mode. There's a bunch of steps in here. It finds the player a new start. It restarts the player at that start location and calls finish restart player. So all these things kind of trigger based on the request coming out of the auto respawn. At the end of the finished restart player, your character gets respawned. And similarly to the spawn policy for this auto respawn, there's also the same spawn policy on the gameplay spawn effect. So when you spawn into a new world, both this gameplay ability, which is listening for you to die, and this gameplay ability, which starts your respawning visuals, happen at the same time. So they both activate upon spawn. The gameplay ability for spawn effects then disables your input so that you can't do anything until you're fully through the spawn event. It triggers a gameplay effect, spawning in, which gives you damage immunity, so no one can hurt you while you're in the state of spawning back in. And then it, through a gameplay cue, does the reassembly effect. So we basically tracked this whole system down from front to back and found nowhere in here where the inventory was being cleared. And so we ended up putting a bunch of breakpoints in and starting to figure out when and where did our inventory disappear and how were we going to deal with it. But it led us to this understanding of how the system is connected together and how the various events fire throughout the component, which gave us the idea to have this new Let's Talk About series. So on to our inventory challenge. So where was it? What we did find is we found event on death finished that clears the inventory. And so in the hero shooter mannequin, there's this very simple node which says, hey, if I'm dead or I'm reset, then clear the inventory. And we were like, okay, so that seemed simple. We started to track down, okay, where is on death finished called from? Well, we look back to the hero default, which is the parent of the shooter mannequin, and we found some more death. We found an on death started event, which is triggered from the health component, which plays a montage, enables the ragdoll, hides the weapons. So that was interesting, but it didn't actually trigger the on death finished event. It was on death start. So we looked deeper into the character default, and there was nothing in the character default class. And then finally, if you look deeper into the Lyra character, you'll see that it adds a dynamic link between the health component on death finished and the Lyra character on death finished. So this event on death finished is linked in the Lyra character to the health component on death finished, which means that when on death finished triggers here inside the chain, in parallel to all these other activities that are occurring, this event gets fired and it clears our inventory. So now we've understood how the event got fired, when the event gets fired, and what the event is doing. So it was up to us now to figure out, okay, how are we going to change this in a non-destructive way so that match-based games still perform these activities, but our game, which requires the inventory to persist, has that option. Basically, what we elected to do was create a child of hero shooter mannequin, calling it hero persistent inventory. Now, we first duplicated hero shooter mannequin to run tests and to figure out exactly what needed to change. So we did a copy and a duplicate first, but then later we said, no, let's make a child class and just override the functions that we need so that all of the changes of hero shooter mannequin would flow through our child, and only the changes that we wanted to make inside of the hero persistent inventory class would apply. There was a weird bug when we used the class versus the duplicate, which we'll talk about at the end of this, but nonetheless, we worked our way through that. We decided that we would need a tag. So we created the gameplay effect granted inventory, which basically applies a tag, because we needed something that would persist through death. And the game state and the ability system persist through death, whereas the player controller and the character are regenerated each time. So we first tried this with a variable, just a standard variable inside of our class. And what we found is that it gets reset to default every time you die. So there was no way of doing that. So which led us to, okay, then we'll apply a tag to the ability system that will persist through death. And that will allow us, when we respawn, to know that we had already been in the match once. We change our game experience to reference the new class, which is done through the hero data. So the hero data asset makes reference to which character class you're going to use. So we needed to create that and change it to be our persistent data. And then the standard components we duplicated only because when we duplicated hero shooter core, there was a component that needed to adjust. You actually don't need this down the child path. So we probably will dump this out and dump this out eventually and just end up with the persist, the granted, the gameplay effect, and the hero data tag. So that's kind of the assets and how we put those together. Next, we were fortunate in that both the add initial inventory and the clear inventory were functions. They weren't macros, they were functions, which meant in our child class, we could override those and it would call our code as opposed to the parent code. So we quickly overrode both the add initial inventory and clear inventory, dropped the parent calls because we don't need those. And then we did a reset inventory on death. And basically added that Boolean, which is sort of a design time Boolean, which says if I check it, then the inventory will reset on death. If I leave it as false, then the inventory will not reset on death. And that was just a trigger mechanism. In the gameplay effect to grant inventory, we simply have a new tag called inventory control initial items granted. And we set its duration to infinite. So as soon as we apply this tag, the ability system component will have this inventory control initial items granted, and it will be there infinitely. So that led us to, all right, here's our new add initial inventory. And we come into the system. Anything in green is the original code from Epic. So if it's got a green box around it, that is what Epic was doing. So none of that changes for us. We added the path test here, which said, okay, if I have my gameplay tag, then I'm going to do a different path. But if I don't, I'm going to take the standard path. So on first pass through here, we perform these activities, which are standard activities out of Epic. And then once through that, we set our tag. So the tag that we set here is the tag that we're checking here. So we run through first time, we set our tag. That tag's true. We then follow the secondary branch instead of the primary branch. We run down this branch where we loop through our inventory and find our quick slots and reset our quick slots. And I'll explain a little bit more why we ended up having to do that. And then finally, coming out of that branch, this cycles forward to the first quick slot. We did make one small change here in the front, whereas there's just a better way than what was here. Here it was looking whether or not there was an initial inventory item, and we want it to be, do I actually have anything that can be quick slotted? So we made a small change there on the add. So that's the add path. Again, we'll go in and look at it in a little more detail. Added a couple of pieces to that, and everything seems to be working fine. So let's take a look at the top block. All right. So the top block says, if reset inventory on death is true, then go ahead and do the standard path. So if reset inventory on death is true, do exactly how a match-based game would work. If it's false, which is our case, then grab the Lyra ability system component, use the control tag that we've identified, determine if we have any of those tags on our ability system, and if the answer is not, we don't have the tag yet, we'll follow the same path that we did here. So if we don't have that tag, we'll follow the standard path. If we do have that tag, we'll follow the other path. At the end of the standard path, if reset inventory death is false, then we'll just basically apply the gameplay effect to ourselves. That gameplay effect is what grants us that tag, and we complete the standard path. The other path says, all right, we need to search our inventory. So in this case, our inventory was not cleared out, but we do have to clear out our equipment, and we do have to clear out our quick slots. In this case, what happens when you follow the second path is you have all of your inventory, and we need to determine in that inventory, do I have items that should be in the quick slot? So in this case, we start with an internal variable quick slots filled, starts out as 0. We grab our inventory, we loop through our inventory. We determine if any of the inventory items have the quick slot fragment. If they do have the quick slot fragment, we'll go ahead and add it to the quick bar, starting off in slot 0. We'll increment slots to slot 1, and we'll check whether or not we've completed all 3 slots. So as soon as we've completed all 3 slots, we can exit. If that case is true, we'll call the break function and exit out. If we're still on, in our case, slot 1, we'll loop back. We'll find the next quick slot. We'll put that in slot 1. We'll advance this to 2. We'll do it one more time, and then finally we'll exit out. So either we'll have processed all the inventory, or we'll have found 3 quick slot items and slotted them into the quick slot. And that's basically the changes to the add initial inventory. If we look at the changes to the remove inventory, when we make a call to clear inventory, we're still doing the same code block that Epic had here. We didn't change any of this. We have the exact same path test occurring here. And if that triggers the alternate path, we'll take the alternate path. The only difference between the primary path and the alternate path is the primary path wipes out the inventory here, and then basically wipes out all of the quick slots here. And when you wipe out a quick slot, by default, you take the inventory with it. So the removal of an item from quick slot unequips it. So therefore, in order for our code to work, we needed to do the exact same thing here as we did here. So in this case, what we're saying is if I have any quick slot items, so if I have any of them at all, then go ahead and remove them. So these two code blocks are essentially the same thing. And that's how we remove the inventory. So let's go, well, let's look at the bug fix first. So before I jump into the game, we had an interesting problem that's primarily a timing-based problem. Where we changed the sequence and the logic of the item and the quick slots, the adds and removes. What we found out is when we launched into the game, our character would be invisible. And we tracked that down to the fact that when the add character part triggers, some of the components aren't yet initialized. And so the standard pick random character, which picks between Manny and Quinn, which we modify to pick a different character, but that's fine. When it fires, if it doesn't have an owner yet, which is unlikely, if it doesn't have a controller, if the controller hasn't possessed the pawn, or the pawn doesn't have its pawn Lyra pawn cosmetic added to it yet, which is added through the experience. If any of those four conditions fail, it's going to silently fail in the code without raising an error. It just basically does a null check on those characters throughout the course of it. Any of them are null, it just ejects without ever assigning the character part. So our fix was basically to add these delay until next tick loops, which says if I'm trying to add the character part to my character and these four components have not yet been initialized, just wait until that component's initialized, and then you can add your character part. So it was a very simple fix. It's just a timing issue with begin play. You can never trust begin plays to fire in a logical and rational sequence. So sometimes you have to put these checks and balances in here to make sure all your dependent components and or actors are all in place before you follow some code. All right, so let's jump in. And with that change made, we will jump to our Shooter Core Plus, where we have our inventory. That's our mannequin. Oh, and our child we put here. And here's our persistent inventory child. So as we said, the hero data defines which pawn class you're going to spawn into the world. In this case, it's our hero persist inventory. And in hero persist inventory, why sometimes it takes long. In this particular class, it's based on hero shooter mannequin as its parent. And we have the two functions clear. We have the two functions clear inventory, which is what we just talked about, and add initial inventory, which we just talked about. So those are the changes, and then our reset inventory on death, which is off, and we should be good to go. So when we launch into the world, we are naked again. So there's the bug that I was talking about. You see that I can move around, do everything I normally do, aim down sights, fire, interact with nodes, but the character is missing. That's the timing issue that we're referring to. Sometimes it works on a second go. No. All right, maybe I'll take a quick look at that. Okay, we're back. It was a relatively stupid mistake. I'll explain it in a second. Basically now, as I interact in the world, picking up my objects, and pulling up my inventory, similar to what we were doing before. So I have a fair amount of stuff right now. I'm going to go on this pad, which is going to kill me. And then upon respawn, I still have all of my inventory. So let's do a couple more tests. Let's have 2 weapons in hand. So I now have 2 weapons. Let's open our storage, put our rocks in storage, and put the raw meat in storage. So we have 2 things in storage, a bunch of stuff in our inventory. We'll go to the pad. Get destroyed again. We had 2 guns. We're going to restart back pistol in hand, but we can still cycle the 2 weapons. If we go to our inventory storage, we have our storage still in our storage bin. We have the rest of our stuff here. And so we can just continue safely through death, knowing that no matter what we do, our inventory is persistent and it's not going to be blown away by a death event. So that was the objective. Again, if you like the new thought process of going down the Let's Talk About path, please leave a comment, including topics. If you think there are topics that you think are particularly interesting on to talk about, we'll talk about those as well. All right, thanks for watching. Oh, one more thing. I said I would explain what went wrong. What went wrong was I had connected a routing over my fix to show you the issue of it being invisible. And then I was going to reconnect it to the proper path and show you being visible. So it did exactly what it was supposed to do, which was spawn the character invisible, because I had basically had this set like that, bypassing the fix. All right. Once again, thanks for watching.